Hi, my name is Bill Pollack, and it's March 2001, and we're at the Peterson Museum, Automotive Museum, and this is part of a program to collect memories and information, knowledge, feelings from a variety of people about their racing experiences, history, and so forth. My interest in cars goes way back, and actually my first car that I can recall was a Model T, a $10 car. And I brought it home, and it was something that you could fix with a set of socket wrenches and a ball-peen hammer, and I mean that literally. And we would tear around my folks' walnut orchard in Encino, California, till the manifolds got cherry red, and then we'd let it cool down, and that would go on for a couple hours, and then probably had to drop the pan on the Model T and bolt up the rods or take some shims out or do something. But it was something that a couple of 13, 14-year-olds could do. And this went on for some time until I got bored, and we built a sled out of 4x4s and did that for a while, and then I got bored again, and I don't remember whether we tilted the T over or whether we actually turned it over, but it was laying on its side, and I sent my brother into the house to get a bottle of ketchup and spread it all over my head and face and body, and my brother went and got my mother, and the scream could be heard for miles. And of course that was the end of the Model T. But I wasn't to be denied. I already had the bug. I had to have some kind of machinery, so I think the next thing was a $15 motorcycle. It was an Indian with a Harley transmission and what they called a suicide clutch. And suicide clutch means that we work like a car clutch. When you held it down, you were disengaged. When you let it up, you were in gear and going. And the only thing about that on a motorcycle is that usually you need both feet on the ground. So with a suicide clutch, you had to have one foot on the clutch, which was fine as long as you had it balanced to the foot on the ground. And I was sitting in the backyard of a friend's home and revving the engines, making it really roar, this Indian Scout. And my foot slipped off the clutch, and I took out a row of Concord grapes, and his father came out, and I thought he was very unreasonable. He told me to get the damn motorcycle off his property, and that was the end of the motorcycle. And I thought, well, now what am I going to do with it? My mother had already forbidden me from owning a motorcycle, so I had to do something. So I said, I'm going to show Mom that I really know how to deal with motorcycles. I'm going to take it home. Well, we had a long driveway, and this garage was in the back of the driveway, and I opened the gate and roared up the driveway, roared into the garage, slammed on the brakes, and kept right on going from the grease on the garage floor, went out the back of the garage, and that was the end of the motorcycle. And then we went on to a series of things, and when I look back, I think, I would never have given me a driver's license. I mean, come on. I mean, I was already a disaster in the making. Well, I'm not going to go through each and every car, but I'm going to jump ahead to I'm early married. I'm out of the service, and I happened to drive down Ventura Boulevard in Studio City, and I saw this TCMG sitting in a showroom, and I just flipped out. I mean, I had never seen anything like that. I was driving this ridiculous big Chrysler sedan that was beyond boring. I mean, it had fluid drive. I mean, you could mash down on the gas pedal and go back and take a nap before this thing got moving. I hated the car. I saw the TC, I had to have one of those, and I used to wake up in the middle of the night thinking about this thing, and I'd get out of bed at 11 o'clock at night and crawl out of the house and drive down to look at it, because they kept the window in the showroom lit. They could see the car. And I was coming back one night, and my wife confronted me. She thought I had a girlfriend. What was I doing out wandering around in the middle of the night? So when she realized that I was in love with this car, she said, well, you know, why don't you get one? It seemed a pretty simple answer. So I looked at it, you know, I eventually found one that had belonged to the president of Mexico's son, and I got this car, and it was a right-hand drive, and it was everything that I wanted, you know, everything. The windshield folded down, you could drive it with a pair of goggles, the wind in your face. My God, that was a lot of fun. And roaring up and down Valley Vista, which was a twisty road near my home, I went through some water and learned that these little skinny 19-inch wheels and tires had no adhesion, none. And car slid sideways and went up over a curb. Of course, it didn't turn over, but the wheels had a nice, they were, you know, like shaped like L's. So that led me to a little store, or not a store, but a wonderful shop down in Hollywood called Pico Wire and Wheel. And eventually that's where everybody that had a TCMG wound up, because you had to constantly tighten the spokes on these big, tall wheels. So I decided I was going to go to 16-inch wheels, which I did, and then it was a matter of that. Now I needed more horsepower. And so I happened to be in my favorite place, which was my mechanic, who at that time was John von Neumann, who later became the Porsche and Volkswagen distributor and a multi-millionaire. At that time, John had a little garage on Ventura, his wife Eleanor, and a collie dog, and a set of tools, and that was it. And John showed me this supercharger called a Shorrock supercharger, and it had its own separate oiling system, which that knocked me out. You know, little bottle that sat on the firewall, and you had a little needle valve, and you adjusted the amount of oil that went into the supercharger, so because it was this blade spinning in there. Well, of course, what would happen is that when you stopped the car, the oil kind of continued to drip in there, so that when you started the car, this plume of smoke came out of the back of the TC, which was exciting. I mean, everybody went, wow, you know, what is that? You know, I looked like a destroyer in World War II for about a minute and a half, and then finally, of course, the smoke went away. Well, it was there, an easy jump from there to the first time trial out of Goleta. I did pretty good. And I had this bug. I had the speed bug, and boy, I had the bit in the teeth. So when the first Palm Springs race came along, I think it was like a $12 entry fee or $20. It was just, you know, very, very moderate. I had to go, and it was just a one-day affair. Went down there and won the novice race, which was the first race. No problem. I was like way out in front. I was Fangio himself. In the main event, I'm going pretty good, and I'm catching everybody, and I'm passing cars, and I'm really storming along. And of course, there's a lot of crazy cars in this race. There's Cadillac convertibles. There's a Cadillac coupe. I think the convertible was driven by Jack McAfee. There's Roger Barlow, who was was the International Motors distributor of Jaguars. He was driving a Jag, and it was the first time the Jaguar had been seen in competition. And it was going pretty good, but the British never understood that California is hot and dry, and it took them years to figure this out. So they still built little tiny radiators. But the Jag was overheating, but that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that he ran out of brakes at the end of the straightaway and took a tour out into the Cholla and the Joshua Tree for a quarter of a mile. There was stuff flying up as this XK120, beautiful car, but off course and off was the first off-road vehicle. Anyhow, John von Neumann was there with a Lee Francis, which is a really, really pretty car, but meant to be driven slowly to the golf course. There were a lot of wild things, Rileys, and a bunch of MGs, of course. They were probably the most prevalent. And there was a special that came down from San Francisco. There was a raconteur from San Francisco named Sterling Edwards, a socialite from from the north. And Sterling had designed his own car called the Edwards Special. It had a V8 60 engine in it, had a special body. It was very pretty. And Sterling was leading the race. And E. Forbes Robinson was in the first, I think it was a TD. And so it was the next grade up in the MG category. Sterling, Forbes was second, and I moved up to third, and I was going fast, and I could catch these guys. So I was right on the verge of getting ready to pass, and we were coming up on the main straightaway by the pits, and my engine just quit, just stopped dead. I was absolutely flabbergasted. I didn't know what had happened. I pulled over, and Ernie McAfee came running up, juggling something in his hands. It was obviously something very hot. It was a bolt that had fallen out of my carburetor that held the carburetor onto the supercharger. So the carburetor was just hanging down. Obviously, the car's not going to go anywhere. So Ernie said, "I think you need this, and I'll be right back." And he ran to the pit and got a crescent wrench, literally. Came back, and within a moment or two, had the carburetor back on and tightened up. And of course, now I'm back to practically last place. I zoom off. I had no pit crew. I don't think anybody did. Take off, and I'm chasing this pack now, and I'm passing cars again. I'm going like crazy. And I finally work my way up to right behind Forbes Robinson, and I'm ready to swing out and go into the lead. And Sterling Edwards gets the checkered flag in front of him, just right then. Oh, I was really devastated. I mean, my goodness, I had this race in my pocket. My first race, and I blew it. No, I didn't actually. But anyhow, that was the bad news. The good news was that Ernie came over to me afterwards, and he said, you did pretty good. And there was a guy here that I worked for by the name of John Edgar who would like to have you drive for him. And I said, well, that sounds great. What? What kind of a car? He said, an MG. He said, I'm working on it. We're hopping it up. We're going to put a supercharger on it. We're going to put an intercooler on it. We're going to do all this crazy stuff. He said, why don't you come by my store next week and we'll talk about it. I said, great. Well, Ernie had a shop right on Cahuenga, right in the middle of it, right at the top of the pass. I went by, and he had this car, and he had put a Crosley radiator in the left door. It was also right-hand drive. And it was going to circulate water through the radiator so that the supercharger was getting cold air. It's called an intercooler. And this sounded really neat to me, and the car felt very strong when I took it out. And Ernie said, well, take it out for a drive, see what you think. I said, where? He said, well, up in Mulholland. Well, there was Mulholland the end of Mulholland was right there, right at Cahuenga Pass. So off I go, and I take off, and I went flying down Mulholland. Well, this car had no mufflers. It had 4 straight pipes that came out about so far from the side of the engine and made an incredible sound. It was like a machine gun. And I went roaring down Mulholland all the way to the end, turned around, came roaring back, and I did this not just once, but a number of times and several days. And I'm sure that the people who lived there, were sticking pins in dolls, were hoping that they would find, whoever was doing this, making this incredible racket, would be found mangled down in the bottom of one of those canyons. I lived through it. And we decided to take this car to the first Pebble Beach race. And that was exciting. I rode up in a tow car, which was a great big Lincoln Continental, and we towed the MG. And John Edgar, who I met, who was this wealthy Texas oil zillionaire, it was said that he had thousands of head of cattle that kept stopping the oil back down in the ground. And John rode up in his Jaguar, which was John didn't drive. John drank a lot. And so John rode up, and Gil Schick, who was an ex-Indianapolis driver, drove John in the XK. Well, the 120 didn't have a top. So Gil tells the story about they're roaring up there, and they stopped in this little gas station to get gas in the Jag, and John's sitting there all huddled up, freezing, and this Ford station wagon pulled in, and this guy got out, nice young man, married, and the station wagon is filled with kids. And the man walked over to the Jag, and he walked around the Jaguar, and he looked at it, and he shook his head, and he said, "Boy, I'd sure like to have one of these Jags." And John looked at him, and he looked at the Ford station wagon, and he looked back at the guy, and he said, "Well, if you didn't screw around so much, you probably could have had one by now." And Gil heard this, and the man, chagrined. And actually, I cleaned that up. John used a little coarser language. Very colorful man, very colorful. I was out at Pebble Beach now. This is not Monterey course. This is Pebble Beach, where we raced around through on the 17-mile drive between the pines, called soft pine, which I'll tell you about later. They're not very soft. With the pits were right in the old stable paddock area. Now, John said, "Why don't you take the Jaguar out and drive around the course and learn the course a little bit?" I said, "Great idea." So I took the Jag out, and I'm flying around Pebble Beach, and I had done probably 8 or 9 laps in the Jag, and all of a sudden, here is this figure out in the middle of the straightaway. It's John Edgar, and he's waving his arms, and he's flapping, and his coat is flapping, and I think something's wrong, and I pull over and stop, and John, I said, "Look, what's wrong?" John reached in. The Jaguar had these big wide doors, and John reached into the door and opened this little flap and pulled out a bottle of scotch, and it seemed he had run out. So that was the reason for that. Anyhow, the next day was the race, and I had practiced in the MG also, and the car was fast. And I don't remember exactly where my starting grid was, but this was I think the first Pebble Beach was like in the early 50s, like 51, 52, something like that. And at the start of the race, I got on it, and I'm flying down the right side, and I'm passing a whole bunch of cars, and all of a sudden the MG quits, and I pull over to the side off the course, and I'm trying to start it, and they had a pull starter, and I keep pulling it. And one of the course marshals came up, and he was shaking me, and I waved, "Get away from me, get away, leave me alone." And I keep pulling the starter. And finally the guy grabs me and pulls me over to the side of the car, and as I'm pulling the starter, I can see these 4 exhaust pipes, and each time the engine turns over, water shoots out of one of the pipes. And I went, "Oh, this is it. It's all over. There's no glory in wherever for me." What had happened, apparently the car had backfired through the radiator, the intercooler that was in the left-hand door, and it had a little pump. Of course, it was just kept pumping water into the engine, which was not a good design feature. Anyway, that was my first Pebble Beach race, which was not too much fun. I think Phil Hill wound up winning it in his Jaguar, and that was it. I had gone from there. I didn't want to race the 88 anymore, and I was actually driving my old TC in Los Angeles, and I stopped in a friend of mine's, Al Moss, who had an MG garage and who did a lot of work for me on my car too. And Al mentioned that he knew somebody up in Washington that had just bought an Allard. I didn't even know what an Allard was. I guess I'd seen one in a showroom again on Sunset Boulevard. And he told me the man's name was Tom Karstens, and he was a meat packer from Tacoma. So I went over to the Allard dealership and see if I couldn't get a ride in one, and the owner, Noel Kirk, said, "Sure." And if I could ride in the passenger seat, which he directed me to, and took me for a one-block ride, just around the block. That was it. Somehow, they didn't know how to sell cars in those days. I want to back up for a minute because Tom, when I found out later, the reason Tom bought the Allard is that he'd come down from Seattle, Tacoma, to buy 2 Jaguars. And he had the money in his pocket. Now, Tom was a meat packer, looked like a meat packer, acted like a meat packer, dressed like a meat packer. Walks into the Jaguar agency, and no one would even come near him. I mean, here was a meat packer. Tom had $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 in cash in his pocket to buy that one and that one, 2 XK120s, and nobody would talk to him. So out he goes up the street to the Allard dealership, buys 2 Allards. So when I called Tom, the first thing he said was, "You had any experience?" I said, "Well, I raced in the Hot Springs race in my TC, and I won the novice race, and I was 3rd in the main." And he said, "What about Allard? Do you know anything about Allard?" I said, "Well, yeah, I've had a ride in one. I didn't say I drove it, and I didn't." He said, "Okay, the car will be in Carmel on such and such a day." This is the 2nd Pebble Beach race, the next year. And the crew will be there, and just go up and tell them who you are and take it out and take it for a drive, and I'll see you on Saturday for the race, for the first practice and all of that. So I arrived up there, and the car was at a standard station in Carmel, and I walked into this garage, and here is this black, gorgeous machine with white wall tires, red wire wheels, absolutely incredibly looking. And the guys are there, and they were, they're ready for me, give me the key to the car, check me out on a few things on the car, and I get in, and I turn the key, and I hit the starter, and the whole building shook. I mean, this thing had one very, very large engine. In my entire life, I had never, ever experienced anything with an engine that big, except when I was in the Air Force flying bombers. I mean, that was, then the airplane shook. But this thing was big. It had a 6-liter engine, a big Cadillac that Edelbrock, and in fact, Victor Edelbrock Sr. and Tom Karstens were very dear friends, and they had actually spent a weekend building this engine. They would get a 6-pack of beer, or probably more like a couple of 6-packs, and they would put this car in a dyno, and they would this engine rather, they'd fool around with it till they got it just right. And that was one of the things about the Allard, was that often, whenever we went to a race, the hood was never raised except maybe to wipe off the chrome or something like that. But I mean, Karstens had a thing about that. Never work on the engine or the car except to clean it, polish it, wipe it off at the track. He wanted everything to be perfect when the car was there, and it always was. So anyway, I took the car and took a drive down Highway 1. Well, those of you who have driven Highway 1 know that it is one hellacious, wonderful road with lots of twists and turns. And I got just and I had a friend of mine sitting in the right-hand seat, Robert Coogan, who was a high school buddy of mine and the brother of Jackie Coogan. And he was huge. He was like 240 pounds, so we had a lot of weight in the car. And we're going down, and we get down, I think we got, past Big Sur, and you can't go fast. So I've been driving 50 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour, and I'm dying to really get on this thing and see what it's got. And of course, there's no windshield. We just had 2 little racing screens. Finally came up over around a little bend, and here's a straightaway that's probably a quarter of a mile long and a big sand dune on the left, and the wind has been blowing in off the ocean. So I punched it. And this car just leaped up on its feet and just like it was catapulted, shot down the straightaway, and the wind, which had been coming from my right, blowing me inland, was going over my head and hit the sand dune and came back, and now all of a sudden I'm getting a wind that's blowing me towards the cliff, which is right next to the right side of the car. And I don't know, my memory says that I looked down and saw rocks and white foam and ocean breakers. I'm not sure about that, but it seemed like that. It seemed like the car moved over. I didn't dare do anything. I slowly eased up on the throttle, didn't dare touch anything else, kept the steering wheel centered, because I was on the shoulder of the road, like borderline grass, and then it dropped off. Like they wouldn't have found anything but our hats. So let the car slow down, slow. Finally pulled off onto a little meadow. Robert never said a word. I never said a word. I shut the engine off. We got out, walked around to the back of the car, and ripped the top off a package of Camels. And I think we smoked at least half the pack. Finally, went, and got back in the car and turned around and went back. Well, it taught me a lot of respect for that car, because that car had, I've been driving a TCMG with 60 or 70 horsepower, and here was something with, I don't know, probably 300 or whatever, but a lot of torque. So the next day was going to be the race, and Carson's got there, and went out, we did some practicing around the course, and I felt very comfortable with the car. Phil Hill was there in an Alpha that sounded like it was going 1,000 miles an hour, because it had all these overhead cams and superchargers and gears and stuff. But it also had a lot of leaks, and there's oil pouring out of this car. Well, anyhow, it didn't do too well. There was a couple of other Allards in the car, in the race. A bunch of Jaguars, a lot of V8 specials and things of that kind. I wound up with the pole position, and when the flag dropped, my adrenaline was probably off the scale, and I don't know where my blood pressure was, and I'm glad I didn't. But this car accelerated like crazy, and there was nothing that would even begin to stay with it on just out of the box. Down to the first corner, got it stopped, and I want to back up for a sec, because it was something that happened when we were qualifying. I had gone out to qualify, and as I got halfway around the course, there was a guy in a Morgan. Now, a Morgan is an English car that hasn't changed in 100 years. It's basically very slow, wooden frame, everything they could make out of wood, they did. I think the pistons were made out of wood. And it's very slow. And I have to practically come to a stop. The guy's like this. And I get around it, but it ruined my qualifying. Well, when I pulled in, I told Tom about it, and he went to the officials, and they said, "Well, we're sorry, sir, but that was it. You get one time." And Tom had a short fuse, and he finally convinced them with some serious language that I should go out again. Well, by this time I am upset. So when I went out the second time, I came down through the straightaway with my foot glued to the floor. This car going way too fast. And I drift through the first turn, I drift down little bend in the straightaway. By the time I get to the shut-off point, I know there's no way I'm going to ever get this car stopped in the corner, which I try to slow it down, and finally I lock it up and I spin out right at the end of the straightaway. No damage to anything, but now there's this dead, because it's killed the engine, dead silence. And I hear this voice, and who should peek out from behind a tree but my old friend John Edgar, who looks out and he says, You okay? You okay, Pollack? Boy, you know, of all the people, anyhow, in spite of my poor performance, I was given the pole position because they knew this car was fast. I never was headed. From the beginning of that race till the end of that race, I was in front. Phil chased me. Other drivers chased me. I could just out-accelerate them, and we had reasonable brakes, and we won that race without any problem at all. And the car, we went on to win, I don't know, a whole lot of races with it at places like Reno, and it was always the same. Phil was chasing me in a Jaguar, and it was usually Phil lost. I didn't win, Phil lost, which is fine. He went on to become the world's champion, and that's worth it. Golden Gate Park, which was a one-shot, one-of-a-kind. Oh no, actually, they raced there a couple of times. I won that, and the Alley was an exciting car. We're going to take a break right now. Most of the races, in fact, my racing career started probably around 1948 or 9, and I think my last race was in 1960 or 61. So I had about a 10-year span. The Allard mostly was in the early 50s. Now, I was mentioning Golden Gate Park. If any of you have been to Golden Gate Park, you know what a spectacular place it is, and somehow or other, the SCCA had got the city fathers to allow a race in the park, and it was pretty exciting, except for the fact that there was one hairpin turn right as you were heading down, right at the buffalo pen, which if you blew the corner, you were going to be upsetting. I was going to say pissing off, but I'm not sure that's correct. But upsetting a lot of buffalo. I'm talking about American bison, who outweighed most of the cars by at least twice. Race was, Phil was in a 2-liter Ferrari, beautiful little car and very fast, and I was in the Allard. The course really suited me, and there was a series of corners that I to this day, I remember them well, and I could set up a drifting pattern before I got to the first one, and I could just go through there was like 3 sweeping bends, and the way the car was set up, the way I was set up, that everything worked, and I was really fast through there. Phil, again, was having, the Ferrari, you know, I think that on a longer course he would have had a distinct advantage, because I'm sure that he probably had top speed on me, but I had him whipped for torque. A 2-liter against a 6-liter, there's no competition. But he did have brakes, and that's where he could gain on me, was in the tight stuff. He could come way deeper into the corners. The Allard had very, very primitive brakes, and the brakes were eventually our Achilles heel. I won Golden Gate Park, and I think it only ran one more time. This was like one of the earliest environmentalist uprisings, when they just couldn't deal with the bird watchers in Golden Gate Park, just couldn't cope with the noise of the cars, and it was disturbing the yellow-bellied sapsuckers or something. And anyhow, I also ran in the second Golden Gate, and I'll come back to that later. This was in 52 or 3. I'm not too sure about dates. All my races were in the early 50s, so in the Allard. So anyway, back to Pebble Beach. Before the Allard would go to a race, after a race, Tom Carson would take the car back to his home, and he had a workshop under his house fronted on Lake Washington. This float plane was tied up on the front of the house. The workshop overlooked the lake. And he and his friends, who were bankers, I mean, a crew I don't know if there was a mechanic in the crew, but they were all like bankers and executives from various businesses. One was a colonel in the Army, and like he cleaned the wheels, which I thought was apropos. But everybody seemed to know what they were doing, and Tom's best friend, Dave Fogg, who is also a big game hunter, Dave was kind of he was the real mechanic, I think. The engine, of course, that's something that Tom and Vic Edelbrock would do. So the rest of it was like checking the gearbox, which I think after each race, because of the huge torque of this engine, they were using a Ford gearbox. One race they'd throw the gearbox away, the next race they'd throw the gears away. So we got, pardon me, 2 races out of a gearbox and gears. We're just terribly overstressing all those kind of parts, the axles and stuff of that kind. A race that comes to mind with the Allard that was a lot of fun for me was Madera, California. This was one of the few times, this was next to the last race I think I had in the Allard. One of the few times that Tom brought the car south to compete. Most of the racing was done in the Pebble Beach, Reno, Seattle Seafair, that kind of thing. It was just too far for him to bring the car down to Torrey Pines or any of the races that we had down south. Madera, I had decided I had a chance to take a ride in a Formula 3 car, which is looks like a belly tank with a motorcycle engine in the back. Very fast, you sit in this thing, a lot of fun. Vibrates like roller skates on cobblestones. And Tom didn't want me to do this, and he was right. But I said, oh, it's okay, it won't bother, yeah, I'll be fine. But the Formula 3 race was before the Allard race. So I went out, I did okay in the Formula 3. But in the Formula 3s, you could go so deep into the turns that it was just ridiculous. Most of the corners you didn't even have to slow down for. So I got out of that car and got into the Allard, where you definitely had to leave a little room before you got to a corner. And at the start of the race, and Phil Hill is in a C Jaguar, I think, and this is probably 53. I shut off way too soon for the turn, and Phil just stormed by me, and I was so upset. Jesus, I really blew it. I mean, here's the first turn of the start. I out-accelerated him on the start. No question about it. I had the fast car, got off the dime, but I shut down too soon. Phil went by. Now I got a problem. I knew that Karstens was going to be really upset because we should win this race. Now on the back part of the course, there's this big sweeping left-hand turn, a big, beautiful sweeper, and there's it's wide, and a lot of marbles on the course. Marbles are little pieces of asphalt or rocks that get on the course, and it makes the course very slippery. So Phil would go into this back turn, this big sweeping bend. He had the right line on it. I had a lot of horsepower that I could throw away. I would take a big wide line and go way on the outside and get all crossed up and throw up look great, by the way. Throw up a spray of rocks and gravel, and there was a rooster tail of stuff going off the back of my car, and I come sweeping back into the turn, always just behind him. Looked great, but it wasn't as fast through the corner as the line he was taking. But every time I did it, I could see that he was watching me. And he kept seeing me sweep out and come roaring in, sweep out, come roaring in. On the next to the last lap, Phil decided I had the right idea, and he took this big sweeping line. The Jag didn't have the power that I had, and when it got out into that marbles, all he could do was sit there and grind away, and I went on the inside, I had him. It was a memorable thing for me because I had to mentally sucker him into doing something that he didn't want to do, but he finally decided, I had the right idea. And it was a wrong idea. But it was a right idea for me, a wrong for him. So I won the race. But Phil and I have talked about that a few times, and he doesn't like to really admit that he got pulled into that situation. I can't blame him. A lot of fun. Won a lot of races in the Allard. The Allard was a spectacular car. It was always perfectly prepared. In fact, one time at Pebble Beach, we won the Concours d'Elegance and the race, the fastest qualifying, and the main event. And at the banquet that night, there was a group that I loved. It was headed up by a science fiction writer by the name of Al Capel, and it was called the Camel Drivers of Outer Mongolia. And they always gave some kind of a crazy award for whatever, you know. And it was a trophy, and it was most coveted because you had to really do something weird to get it. Well, they gave it to me for verve and offensiveness, that I would win the concours and the fastest and the race and all that stuff. I mean, that's really offensive. And I think the gal who had this gal was part of the group, Vicky, and she was with one of the she was a rocket scientist, but she could do the dumb blah blah, you know, the dumb duh, Dora number perfectly, and she would write these presentations, and it was marvelous, and I wish I had a copy of it to this day. But what they gave me was a tallow lamp, which is I still have, and it's one of the trophies I really treasure. One wonderful thing happened to me too at Pebble Beach. After the race, for some reason I was by myself. My wife had gone back to the bungalow or where we were staying, and I walked off the course. I went into the Pebble Beach Lodge, and I walked into the bar, and I still had the Pirelli driving suit, the blue driving suit, and I had the proper cosmetically applied grease under the eyes from the goggles, and I looked pretty good. And I walked into the bar to get a beer, and this woman says, you sir, you sir. And here's this lady, my guess she's probably about, I don't know, in her 50s, maybe a little older, I don't know. And she has her retinue. She has her secretary, she has this young kind of a gay guy who I don't know what his job was. He kind of bounced around. And she asked me to have a drink with her. And I said, oh, yeah, okay. And she immediately launched into this pitch that she was looking for someone to drive her and her Mark 7 Jag. Mark 7 Jagger was kind of a wannabe Rolls. It had a little 6-cylinder engine in it, and it was the kind of a car that if you didn't drive it too much and kept it parked in the garage and waxed it a lot, it was a good thing to have. In Carmel especially, bring it out, park it outside on a sunny day, and move it quickly into the garage if it started to fog up. She wanted somebody to drive this car with her and her group to New York and then help her entertain at her villa on Lake Como. I mean, this was a pitch, and I was getting it. And I was a young kid. I'm like in my mid-20s, but I picked up something was going on here. I was being approached to do something. And it was part of the Carmel, the things that I like about Carmel. Boy, they don't hold back. And I never remembered her name, or if I did, I had it surgically removed. I'm sure she went on to bigger and better things. I certainly hope so. But that was one of the most, well, I shouldn't say the first time I was hit on, but it was like a pretty powerful hit. And well done, professionally done. It was long after that we ran the Allard, and we're doing very well. And then finally, Phil was getting bigger and bigger Ferraris, faster and faster cars, and we were pretty much at our limit. We had made refinements in suspension, and the engine was about as good as you're going to get. But the problem we had right from the get-go were the brakes. And on the last race that I had in that car, eventually the brakes started to go, the left front wheel started to smoke. And I could see, because the Ballard had open wheels, I could see smoke coming off the brake lining, and the left front wheel was locking up, and Phil was right on my butt. And behind him, Phil was in a 3-liter Ferrari, and right behind him in a 4.2 or 5-liter something, bigger Ferrari was Spear. Can't remember his first name. Bill Spear. And I finally realized that if I tried to stay in front of Phil, I was going to lose the car. I might, go off the road or something. So I eased up a little bit and waved him by, and then blocked Spear. And I finally, I think Spear got by me too, and I wound up finishing third. And it was shortly after that brought the car into the pits, and everybody was concerned what happened. I told them what happened, and this mechanic said, who was not my mechanic, this was another mechanic who was with a friend of mine, wanted to know if he could take a ride around the course with me. This is after, race is over, course is closed. Now there's pedestrians and there's people driving on the course going home. And so I said, the race is over. And I said, okay. So he gets in the car and we go off, drive down the first corner, and I make a right-hand turn, and I can't even get up enough speed to show him how the wheel is locking up. So I push down on the throttle, accelerate, and that instant the left rear axle broke. So all the power was directed into the right rear wheel, and the car made a left turn right into a tree. And I remember seeing the tree was about as far from my radiator as the steering wheel is from my nose. And my foot was still on the throttle. And that's when I really first realized that I wasn't perfect. And we hit the tree, and I hit the steering wheel, and I think I was briefly knocked out. My friend Chuck, or the mechanic Chuck, hit the fascia of the car, and he was injured. He was in the hospital for a few weeks, and he was seriously hurt. The car was totaled. The car was demolished. That was the end of the Allard, at least for about 20 years. It finally emerged in the 90s, restored by a man, and I eventually went back and drove it again. But after the Allard, I went on to other cars. I drove a Curtis Buick for Bill Murphy at Santa Barbara. This was in the 50s, late 50s. Then I had a series of rides in specials. These were, one was built by Willis Baldwin in Santa Barbara. A Baldwin special had a Ford flathead in it, fast car, and handled pretty good. It was very light too, so that added to it, and we did very well in that car. One thing comes to mind, most of the cars I drove and raced were pretty straight machines. I never really got involved with using illegal fuel or things like that. But I got a call one day from Max Hoffman, and Max distributed almost every foreign car that came into the United States. Max either was the distributor or had a piece of the deal. He was a wheeler and dealer, and he had Alfa Romeos. And he asked me if I'd like to drive this little Alfa, and I thought, I had driven one, and to me it was a pretty little car, the little Giulietta, It had about a 1,500 cc engine in it, double overhead cams, nice big thin brakes, very Italian, but the car was really small. I said, you know, I don't know, Max, is there anything special? He said, well, Max had a thick German accent. He said, well, we had the car built for Mr. Shelby, and he can't drive it. I thought maybe you'd like to. I said, well, you know, it's built for Carol, okay. What I didn't know was that this car even looked like a regular off-the-showroom floor car, but totally aluminum. I mean, there wasn't a standard factory part left in that car. Everything, if you look at it, it looked like a stock Alpha. So this was a race up in Santa Barbara, and Dan Gurney was in the race, and Dan was a storm engine. Dan was driving for John von Neumann, and he was driving a brand new Porsche Super Speedster, which at that time was the hot car in the 1500 category. I mean, nobody could touch it. And I thought, well, you know, we'll be lucky to even wave as he goes by. Well, I couldn't believe it. This Alpha was so fast and handled so well that I'm driving around Dan. I'm on the outside, I'm on the inside. It didn't matter. I could go anywhere I wanted on the course. And this car was turning 8,000, 9,000, just unbelievable RPMs that no Alpha before or since, I think, has ever done. But the one time I'd raced for Max Hoffman, I think I won the race. It was a 1,500 cc race. I don't count the little ones, but it was fun. It was a good time. I ran up. One of my favorite courses was Torrey Pines. Now, in the mid-50s, we had this Cal Club, the California Sports Car Club. I was one of the early presidents. I think I was president of it 2 or 3 times, and I was also head of the contest board. But we had organized a race up in Apple Valley, and we had talked to the sheriff or somebody like that, and he said okay, but then a week before, or practically days before the race, he went on vacation, and his under assistant, who hadn't been informed about the race, said, no way, you're not going to race up here. So the club had to find a race in a hurry, and we did. We went down we found Torrey Pines. I don't remember how we did it, but we did it. And we decided to have a 6-hour race. And a friend of mine, Warren Olson, who went on to build a race car for Lance Revenlow, the Scarab, had put together this Porsche. And I decided I would love to drive in a 6-hour race, and I was going to trade off with a friend of mine, Cy Etter. The car was just going like crazy, and Torrey Pines was a lot of fun to drive, the race, the course itself. Torrey Pines then it had been an Army base, and there was nothing left but foundations of the buildings and the streets. And they laid out a pretty darn nice course that was up on the cliff where the golf course is now. And we ran around that thing, and after 3 hours I had to come in for fuel, and I decided I really didn't want to stop. I wanted to keep going, but I had to pee. And we had to refuel in a very public area. Nope, it wasn't in the pit area. They weren't going to allow us amateurs to pour gasoline in our cars, so we had to pull into a refueling area where the truck was and all of that. And so I'm going crazy. I've got to take a whiz, and there's hundreds of people standing around watching these cars being refueled. And so I got out and I knelt down by the left rear wheel while they're putting gas in the Porsche, like I'm looking at something, and called Warren over, and I said, you know, come here, stand behind me. And I got a couple of other guys, and I did my number. And Cy, who's wondering, you know, aren't I going to go drive? Aren't I? I said, no, I'm sorry, Cy, I want to do it. So I went back in the car, and I finished out the race, and I won the under 1500 for the Enduro. Ran there a couple of times, drove a Ferrari for Tony Paravano, let's cut it for a second. I'm running out of steam here.
Yeah, you did. Okay, you ready? And I'll give you the 2 minutes left.
Okay.
You're on.
Racing in the 50s was was really wonderful. There was, you know, it was all amateur. We could go on endlessly with the stories about the spirit of the times, of Trader Vic, the restaurateur, coming down to Pebble Beach and setting up an entire restaurant in the pit area, of people doing things because they wanted to, because it was a lot of fun. Sebring was a great beginning. Enduro was a 12-hour race. I went there with Lance Revenlow, Barbara Hutton's son, and Warren Olson, my friend, in his Maserati. And I remember we went out, Lance started the race, and our big thing was to try and you know, win our class. Well, we were up against Richie Ginther in a 2-liter Ferrari, and we had a 2-liter Maserati. We had faster top speed, but they had, I think, better brakes. So I know that when I got out, when it was my turn, we were running about third or fourth, and I managed to bring us up to first, and I was out there, and I thought I was pretty fast. Now, Ron Fangio was racing for the Maserati team also, and I was heading down into the hairpin turns at Sebring, which was a washboard thing, a very difficult area to drive in and at speed. And Richie's right on my butt. And Fangio came around the outside, off the line of the corner in this huge, big Maserati, and looked over at me like waving, like, hey, nice the way you're doing, you know, you're doing a fine. And I never saw anybody go so fast in my life. And later that evening, I went out at night and watched Fangio come through turn one, where during the daytime, he would drift right out to the outer edge of the course and throw up dirt. He was so close to the edge. At night, he did the same thing. And anyhow, that was kind of getting towards the end. I raced a couple of more times, and Dean Van Lines had a car a Lister Chevy. I ran it at Riverside, the very first Riverside race. And then I went up to Monterey for the very first Monterey races, and decided that was about the time for me to really quit. I decided that, you know, I was starting to think about other things at speed. You don't do that when you lose your concentration. Anyhow, that's it for now. It's been fun doing this, and I'll see you soon.